and we are back for prepping for winter, and the long-awaited Forsaken analysis has arrived. Before we get into that, I want to mention something cool that I missed in the Asha fragment. Mark G171 pointed out that the Frey in the blue armor that Asha thinks is the leader of the Frey army is almost certainly Big Walder and not Hosteen Frey. He comes to Winterfell with armor like this back in A Clash of Kings. This means that either Asha is mistaken on who the Frey leader is and Hosteen is somewhere else, like perhaps the man carrying the head, or alternatively, that Big Walder, a 9 or 10-year-old boy, is somehow leading the Freys because Hosteen has fallen. Whatever the case, I did mention that the Frey in the blue armor is supposed to mirror Barristan over in Slaver's Bay, and Big Walder mirrors Barristan a whole lot better than Hosteen. Big Walder being young and Barristan being old, and Barristan pulling his stunt at the tourney that made him Barristan the Bold around the same age as Big Walder. Anyway, on to the Forsaken. The Forsaken is of course an Aeron Greyjoy chapter, so rereading The Prophet or The Drowned Man is really good prep for this. But also, many of the events in this chapter occur around the same time as the Reaver chapter, so reviewing that chapter is helpful as well. I think many people voted for me to tackle the Forsaken chapter next because it's filled with so much apparent magic and prophecy, rivaled only by perhaps Daenerys 4, A Clash of Kings and that. But we also have to remember that the Aeron story begins with him performing CPR on people and passing it off as a miracle. And Aeron, perhaps more than any other character other than Cersei, is plagued by him being crazy and an unreliable narrator. We really must approach the Forsaken chapter with a skeptical eye. And so let's begin. The Forsaken. So the Aeron chapters continue the pattern of not having Aeron's name. We have the Prophet, the Drowned Man, and now the Forsaken. Now, titles of chapters when they're not someone's name seems to represent lost characters who are not fully themselves, as say with Theon, Arya, or Sansa, or alternatively, a character who is not fully actualized, as say with Quentyn, Areo Hotah, or Asha. The examples we have of people reclaiming their names, as say with Victarion, Barristan, or Theon, seem to mark when the characters find themselves and come into their own. Essentially, Aeron seems to have some potential that he has not yet realized. It was always midnight in the belly of the beast. So our chapter begins with a reference to the Bible. The belly of the beast refers to the stomach of the great fish that swallowed Jonah in the Old Testament. That is, Jonah the Prophet, Jonah the Drowned Man, Jonah the Forsaken. In case you aren't familiar with the story of Jonah, God demands that he become a prophet, Jonah tries to run away, and a storm hits his ship. The crew sacrifices him by throwing him overboard, and he is saved by God by having a great fish swallow him. He lives in the belly of the beast for 3 days before exiting and finally becoming a prophet like God wanted in the first place. Now the term belly of the beast, though, is not exactly limited to Jonah. In the Bible, we often have a prophet protagonist going through hard times. In fact, in the book of Matthew, Jesus is compared to Jonah with regard to his trip into the desert where he is tempted by Satan. So while the belly of the beast may more directly refer to Jonah, it also refers to Jesus. The mutes had robbed him of his robe and shoes and breechclout. He wore hair and chains and scabs. Salt water sloshed around his legs whenever the tide came in, rising as high as his genitals, only to ebb again when the tide receded. His feet had grown huge and soft and puffy, shapeless things as big as hams. So from the Prophet chapter, we know that Aeron dons a sealskin breechclout that covers his genitals. This has been taken from him, leaving him buck naked and likely humiliated. We also find that salt water is being used as a form of torture on Aeron, which is clearly being done ironically. In the Prophet chapter, Aeron does not flinch from the sea, which he describes as God's caress. Aeron would previously find strength from the sea, but now that same sea is being used to break him. Aeron's feet have grown to become shapeless masses, which is highly reminiscent of Doran Martell and his gouty feet. He knew that he was in some dungeon, but not where, or for how long. So we find out that Aeron is in a dungeon, which is not at all where anyone could have guessed he would be. When we last left Aeron in the Reaver chapter, he was vowing to lead a resistance against Euron. As with the Theon chapter, this sample chapter is a surprise location for our character. Now I will say, over the course of the series, a dungeon is a remarkably common place for our characters to find themselves. Ned, Davos, Tyrion, Cersei, Arianna, Asha, Theon, and Jaime all find themselves imprisoned at some point, usually in a dungeon. And Bran, Arya, Jon, Quentyn, and Brienne spend important periods of time beneath the earth in dungeon-like locations. Quite significantly, Aeron's situation is very similar to Bran and Arya in that he is spending time in complete darkness. In fact, Aeron's darkness may actually be simultaneous with Arya's. Darkness, of course, helped Bran and Arya awaken their telepathic gifts, perhaps because of sensory deprivation, so I do wonder if a similar thing is going on here with Aeron. And we'll find many, many more parallels to Bran and Arya later on. There had been another dungeon before this one. In between, there had been the ship, the Silence. So we find out that Aeron's imprisonment has been going on for quite a while. Aeron is being transported and re-imprisoned wherever Euron goes. So Euron is going through quite a bit of trouble with regard to Aeron. The enormous question that lingers throughout this entire chapter is, why is Aeron so important? Of course, this is essentially the same big question in the Theon chapter, with Theon playing the same tortured prisoner of the king instead of Aeron. Stannis clearly thought Theon was important, but we had a long list of reasons why. Heir to the Iron Isles, nullification of the Kingsmoot, knowledge of Winterfell, knowledge of the Dreadfort, important to Dagmar Cleftjaw, important to Theon's mom who's keeping the Glover hostages. Aeron, on the other hand, is pretty much meaningless in the Game of Thrones. Other than a few religious extremists back on the Iron Isles, no one really cares about him. So why is Euron going through all this trouble to keep Aeron alive? Personal amusement? Or is the reason something supernatural? The night they moved him, he had seen the moon floating on a black wine sea, with a leering face that reminded him of Euron. Now this passage is very reminiscent of Tyrion on the Rhoyne, where he believes he is being watched by the moon. In fact, Euron and Tyrion may be thinking their thoughts on the same night. Now in our story, the moon is often associated with telepathic communication, whether it be Jon receiving messages from other direwolves through the moon, or Quaithe visiting Dany in moonlight, or moonlight shining on people while they have odd fever dreams. I theorize that the moon is acting as a satellite with telepathic signals being bounced off it, but others would simply say it's magic. Either way, when Aeron thinks someone is watching him through the moon, it's entirely possible that, in fact, someone is. Rats moved in the darkness, swimming through the water. They would bite him as he slept, until he woke and drove them off with shouts and thrashings. Aeron's beard and scalp crawled with lice and fleas and worms. He could feel them moving through his hair, and the bites itched him intolerably. His chains were so short that he could not reach to scratch. The shackles that bound him to the wall were old and rusted, and his fetters had cut into his wrists. When the tide rushed in to kiss him, the salt got in the wounds and made him gasp. So much like Theon at the Dreadfort, Aeron too finds himself tortured by rats. Aeron is also tightly chained to the wall, again like Theon with Stannis. Of course, the more obvious allusion is that Aeron is a stand-in for Jesus. Aeron, the Forsaken prophet, is in a Christ-like position, suffering. The shackles even cut into his wrists as if he were crucified. When he slept, the darkness would rise up and swallow him. And then the dream would come, and Yuri, and the scream of a rusted hinge. So once again the darkness is highlighted, and as with Bran and Arya, this time the darkness is associated with dreams. However, unlike Bran and Arya, who drift off into wolf dreams and warging because of the darkness, Aeron is stuck in one reoccurring dream, it seems, that of Yuri and the rusted hinge. This dream, of course, plagues Aeron regularly in the Prophet and Drowned Man chapters as well. He actually only has one night of relief from this dream that we know of, and that is the night he decided to call the Kingsmoot. We aren't sure if Aeron is being sent the dream of the rusted hinge, or if so, by whom. The only light in his wet world came from the lanterns that the visitors brought with them, and it came so seldom that it began to hurt his eyes. A nameless, sour-faced man brought his food, salt beef as hard as wooden shingles, bread crawling with weevils, slimy, stinking fish. Aeron gobbled it down and hoped for more, though oft as not, he retched the meal up after. So the details of Aeron's imprisonment seem to call back other characters' imprisonments. Ned in particular noted his eyes were hurt by light, and he also suffered from reoccurring dreams. The nameless jailers evoke Davos with his jailers that he named Lamprey and Porridge in A Storm of Swords. Aeron, though, does not eat as well as Davos did. Clearly Euron is giving Aeron just enough food to keep him alive, while submitting him to maximum torture. But again, enough to live for some reason. The man who brought the food was dark, dour, mute. His tongue was gone, Aeron did not doubt. That was Euron's way. The light would leave when the mute did, and once again his world would become a damp darkness, smelling of grime and mold and feces. In this passage, there seems to be a callback to Davos and Arianna, who are also visited by silent jailers. Now here, Aeron assumes his jailer on the Silence is a mute. It should be noted that Asha, Victarion, and Aeron all believe the Silence is crewed by mutes. That said, I'm not sure how a ship could possibly function with mutes. Screaming communication to each other is really a quite essential thing in sailing. I couldn't imagine a two-man sailboat functioning without verbal communication, let alone an entire longship complete with dozens of rowers who need to act in unison. Now, perhaps the whole mute thing is only a legend and they really do have tongues, but Aeron later observes the mute sailors in action, so it appears they really are mutes. So we really must consider, how are they all able to function without speaking? Telepathically? Does Euron have a mute net? Sometimes Euron came himself. Aeron would wake from sleep to find his brother standing over him, lantern in hand. Once aboard the Silence, he hung the lantern from a post and poured them cups of wine. "Drink with me, brother," he said. That night he wore a shirt of iron scales and a cloak of blood-red silk. His eye patch was red leather, his lips blue. So here we find Euron has come to visit Aeron. Euron's lips are of course blue like a warlock's from drinking too much shade of the evening. I should mention that the blue lips may be a medical condition called cyanosis. A number of things can cause this, but one of them is seizures. We aren't sure what happens to people's bodies when they're on a shade of the evening drug trip. It's entirely possible that someone like Dany was simply convulsing in a single room in the House of the Undying. Or she could have been running around in circles or hitting her head against walls. We simply don't know. Now Euron coming to drink with Aeron of course mirrors the scene in the Reaver chapter where Euron tries to drink with his brother Victarion. Though this drinking with Aeron seems to happen chronologically first. Now here Euron oddly puts on a costume. We know his eye patch is normally black, but here he dons a red one, which mirrors Bloodraven's one red eye. He also wears a shirt of black iron scales, which might make him look like a crow or a raven. Black iron is the metal of Ravencraft at the Citadel. Alternatively, he could be trying to look like a black dragon with red eyes. But the larger point is, this is a costume. Euron is trying to make himself look sinister. A sailor has little reason to be wearing iron scales out at sea, and a silk cloak is a ceremonial cloak. Euron seems to have dressed up in order to try to torture Aeron emotionally. Though I will say there's a small chance that this scene is occurring right before the attack on the Shield Islands, and Euron is actually dressed eccentrically for battle. But if that were the case, they'd actually be sailing east and not south, as Euron says later. "Why am I here?" Aeron croaked at him. His lips were crusty with scabs, his voice hard. "Where are we sailing?" "South. For conquest, plunder, dragons." So Aeron asks the big question. Why is he here? Again, this gets at the main underlying question of the chapter. Why is Aeron important? Euron dodges the question and answers Aeron's second question of where they are going. South for conquest, plunder, and dragons. Let's remember that in this scene, Euron has not yet sent off Victarion in his stead for Slaver's Bay. Euron still believes he is heading for dragons. Madness. "My place is on the islands." "Your place is where I want you. I am your king." "What do you want of me?" "What can you offer me that I have not had before?" Euron smiled. "I left the islands in the hands of old Eric Ironmaker, and sealed his loyalty with the hand of our sweet Asha. I would not have you preaching against his rule, so I took you with us." So Aeron calls Euron's desire for dragons madness. Madness is something that is repeatedly pinned on Euron. Baelor Blacktide, of course, says, Balon was mad, Aeron was madder, and Euron is maddest of them all. Later, this becomes a bit of a mantra for Victarion. But is Euron really mad, or is there actually calculus to his plan? If there is a rational plan, Euron is being quite coy about it. Here Aeron essentially re-asks the big question, what do you want of me? Again, why is Aeron so important? Euron, though, dodges the question again, first claiming that he doesn't want anything from Aeron, while hinting that he molested him. Euron then claims he doesn't want Aeron speaking against Eric Ironmaker on the Iron Isles. This seems quite an unlikely reason. First, Euron specifically says he doesn't really care about the Iron Isles, and is giving them to Victarion. It's the Iron Throne that he wants. Second, Euron is away from the islands with hundreds of ships on a quest for dragons. If successful, honestly, who cares about Aeron's little resistance movement? And third, the explanation doesn't explain why Aeron is being kept alive and tortured. Euron said, "Your place is where I want you." So Euron clearly wants Aeron in the dark and tortured. But why? Well, the answer seems to come next. "Release me. Your god commands it. Drink with me. Your king commands it." Euron grabbed a handful of the priest's tangled black hair, pulled his head back, and lifted the wine cup to his lips. But what flowed into his mouth was not wine. It was thick and viscous, with a taste that seemed to change with every swallow. Now bitter, now sour, now sweet. When Aeron tried to spit it out, his brother tightened his grip and forced more down his throat. So now Euron forces Shade of the Evening down Aeron's throat, and in doing so, Euron's plan for Aeron becomes a little bit clearer. If you remember, Euron tried to feed the drink to Victarion in the Reaver chapter, claiming he wanted to open Victarion's eyes. Of course, this isn't the only time we've heard about this drink being used to open one's eyes. In A Clash of Kings, Dany also drinks Shade of the Evening, for which Pyat Pree claims the drink will remove the caul from her eyes. So Euron wants to open Aeron's eyes, but what does that mean? Well, it should be noted that Aeron finds that Shade of the Evening has a taste that shifts from bitter to sour to sweet. Dany has a similar experience with the drink's shifting tastes. It starts out tasting like ink and spoiled meat, only to shift to anise, milk, cum, blood, and gold. But I highlight the taste-shifting nature of Shade of the Evening because it also relates back to Bran and Arya again. Bran eats acorn paste, which shifts in taste as well, going from bitter to sweet. It reminds him of honey, snow, pepper, cinnamon, and a kiss from Cat. Of course, Bran's training is described as a process of opening his third eye. So the psychotropic nature of acorn paste seems to be similar to that of Shade of the Evening. And Arya has a similar experience with candles at the House of Black and White. The Faceless Men have candles that give visions, much like Shade of the Evening. And when Arya smells a candle, she smells Winterfell, snow, smoke, pine, stables, Hodor laughing, Robb and Jon battling, Sansa singing, crypts, bread, the Godswood, her wolf, and fur. And of course, Arya's training is very much about seeing things that are normally unnoticed, namely secrets and lies. So Euron, like Bloodraven and the Kindly Man, seems to be training a student. And that student, Aeron, like Bran and Arya, has been exposed to sensory-depriving darkness and psychotropic drugs, all in a process of opening his eyes. Now with both Bran and Arya, the opening of eyes seems to mean the unlocking of mental abilities. So I would say it's quite likely that Euron is trying to unlock Aeron's telepathic gifts. We know that at least some Ironborn are telepaths, namely the Farwinds, who can skin change seals. So at least some special genes are floating around. And Bloodraven does tell us that those that are special are not robust. And Aeron makes a point of saying that 9 sons were born from the loins of Quelyn Greyjoy, and he was the least of them. So I would say it's quite likely that Aeron is a powerful telepath, or at least Euron thinks he is. That's it, priest. Gulp it down. The wine of the warlocks. Sweeter than your seawater, with more truth in it than all the gods of earth. So Euron says that Shade of the Evening holds truth in it. Dany, of course, when she visits the House of the Undying, also seeks truth that is supposedly unlocked by this drink. Now, it's not really certain what Euron hopes to do with Aeron's so-called truth. Bran's reason for eating the weirwood paste was to help awaken his gifts and wed him to the trees. He was being absorbed into the weirwood net. A similar thing happens to Dany, where she takes Shade of the Evening, and the Undying attempt to absorb her, only to be foiled by Drogon. Of course, it's hard to see how Euron could absorb Aeron like the weirwood net or the Undying. Can Euron link into Aeron's mind in the same way that the Stark children and their wolves seem to be telepathically linked? I know all of this talk about telepathic links sounds crazy, but it does all get back to how the silence can possibly function. And I will say that Euron did somehow know the prayers of Hoster Tully. That is, he heard the prayers to be saved from the crabs inside his belly. Considering that Euron was on the other side of the world when these prayers were being made, some sort of cross-the-world communication had to have been taking place. Of course, not all mental gifts are telepathic. Arya's gift, if legitimate, would allow her to shift her face. Is this perhaps telekinesis instead of telepathy? We aren't really sure of the magnitude of Aeron's abilities. He receives visions, certainly, but so do so many other people. He can piss really far and perform CPR really well. Is there some telekinesis in that? It's hard to say. Now, with all the talk of truth, one might think that Euron is trying to awaken the gift of prophetic visions in Aeron. But if Euron is trying to do that, he never takes advantage of it. He never asks Aeron about his dreams. Again, unless Euron can read Aeron's mind, there seems to be no point in giving him visions. Anyway, that's all for now. We'll continue this read and analysis in the Forsaken Part 2. We'll see you then.